We are starting off with the build of our 20cc profile airplane. I'm back in the basement of the house here working in the shop. I don't have enough tools over at the office yet to be able to really build, so and this isn't really building, we're just going to mount some hinges, but we're just going to go through these steps one by one. Video might get a little bit long, but that's okay. We're going to talk about getting these babies in correctly, and there's different ways to do it. I'll use epoxy and Vaseline and a pipe cleaner, but the first step with our 20cc profile airplane is to open up the back of the tail. Now, so the way you have to do it is you actually remove this section of the trailing edge of the fin and the back of the fuselage, and then you put the airplane together. So the first step we're going to do is cut this, and it helps to have a little guideline using a square. And if I take any longer to find my T-square, the phone's going to ring again. Come on, where'd you go? There it is. This is the shop I've been in for the last few months, and so far it's working out alright. Now this in the middle is going to go about there, so this is going to go about here. And I'm wondering to myself, I'm saying self, if this is here, is there going to be enough room? I'll just take the whole thing out. I was thinking maybe I would take less of this out, just enough to get this connector fitted through there, and then leave it for strength. But that's not how the plans show it. So what I'm going to do is just do this the way the plans say to do it, which is to take it out even with this line. So I just want a nice reference line here for when I cut this. Alright, and that line on top is going to guide me on the bottom. So, can you see that looking over my shoulder? This is basic stuff for some of you guys that have been building and flying for a while. For people that are just getting started, that might have never had a wood-framed airplane, yeah, this is going to be a little freaky, putting a knife to the back of an airplane for the first time. So I'm just using a regular X-Acto blade in the red handle. This is the larger size handle. There's a bunch of different knife blades you can get. You don't even have to use X-Acto. Hopefully your workshop will be a little cleaner than mine. Mine is a disaster right now. So I'm just using that cut mark lined up with the back of the fuselage here. That'll be my guide for this one. Before I didn't have a cut mark, so I didn't really have a reference other than that pencil line. Alright, swing this around, line it all up. And this is the first step. Do not attach hinges, or do not glue your hinges into place on the back of the horizontal stabilizer. What I'm trying to say is don't attach these two things until you've got this out and the horizontal stabilizer. Technically speaking, this is the horizontal stabilizer. These are the elevator halves. So don't attach these until this horizontal stabilizer has been mounted. Alright, and we'll go through those steps also. That's the first step though. You got to cut open the back of the fuselage so the horizontal stabilizer can be put into place. All the dimensions can be checked, and then it can be mounted. Alright, that's what we're going to work on next. Once you've got the back of the fuselage opened up, the next step is to install the horizontal stabilizer and to make sure it's perfectly straight. if the horizontal stabilizer is installed where it's too far on one side or the other, or if this trailing edge is not perfectly parallel with the wing, or you could say perfectly perpendicular to the center line of the fuselage, then every time the elevator goes up and down, it's actually going to want to corkscrew the airplane around. So it's extremely important, if you're going to do one thing on the airplane perfect, it's mounting your tail feathers. So the fin here is already installed, but what you have to do is get the elevator, or get the horizontal stabilizer in there perfect. So what I've done, let me just make sure we are recording. Yes, we are. What I've done is I've measured the span of this elevator, and it's 19 inches, so I've marked the center, and then I've also measured the span of the horizontal stabilizer up at the front here before the taper, and that's also 19, so I've marked that, and I'm using blue tape just to make my marks a little bit easier to see. Okay, so I've got a center mark there and a center mark there, and then I've also put a little tape to show the width of the fuselage, and I've got some marks on here that show the width of the fuselage. Now this isn't the end-all be-all. This isn't going to be, you know, I'm not done with just that. All that's doing is it's getting me close to where I need to be when I get this finally glued in. And the way I'm going to check it is with a tape measure. So again, if you've built airplanes before, you've probably seen this stuff being done. But if you haven't, this is a vital skill that you need to know building not just this airplane, but all airplanes. Because this kind of precision and this kind of accuracy with assembly, especially final assembly of these big components, it's really important if you want your airplane to be just dead on perfect the way it flies. So what I've done to do this, I've blocked up the fuselage with a clamp and a couple blocks of scrap wood, and then I've also put a little scrap of plywood on the nose of the profile fuselage. And what I'm going to do, because I'm here in the shop by myself, if my son was home, if my wife was more cooperative, I would, you know, I'd have help, but I don't. And my daughter also, she's 13 going on 14, so what are the odds I'm going to get her to come help me for more than like 30 seconds before we're yelling at each other? So what I've done so that I could do this in the shop by myself is I've drilled a little hole at the number 10 on my tape measure, okay? And I've also put a little scrap of wood up here on the nose. And what I'm going to do is pin the tape measure to the nose of the airplane through the number 10. And if I get the hole centered in the tape measure, I'll be able to measure on the left side or the right side of the tape down here, and it'll be the same. So what we're going to do is we're going to try to measure from this point on the nose of the airplane, which is dead center on the fuselage. Okay. So we're going to measure a point on the horizontal stabilizer here, and then the same exact point over here. And we're going to try to get this to within about a 32nd of an inch of accuracy. Now, this corner might not be exactly the same on both sides. This corner back here might not be exactly the same on both sides, but we're going to try to just eyeball it and make it as close as we can get it. So, just as a first measurement, using my lines on the tape to try to get this lined up as well as possible. And I'm wearing the same shirt that I had on in the video from this morning. And I'm feeling a little better this evening. Thank you, whoever that was that just asked. So what I'm trying to do is, I have lines, and that's a good starting point, but now this is how we get it perfect. So, measuring from here back to here, I have just over 54 1/4. So that would be 54 and like 9/30 seconds. Okay, we want to make sure this is down all the way. So just over 54 1/4. On this side, if I switch it over, it's just under 54, so I'm off by a 1/16 of an inch. Now some of you might say, that's fine, stop. But I'm going to try to get it better than that. Okay? So I'm just going to set my tape measure down, and as carefully as I can, I'm just going to move this a little bit. Okay? So, and your numbers might be different depending on where you put the hole in the tape measure. I put the hole at 10, so that's why I'm measuring 54 1/4. So let me measure this again. So now here, I made it worse, 54 3/16. And then over here, yeah, I made it worse. So, let me put this down again. Okay, and I know the tape in the back is perfect as far as this being centered, so I want to keep the tape in the back perfect, and all I'm doing is shifting it a little bit left or a little bit right in order to get it. The phone always rings when the video is running. That's just...
Call from Build Vid. Call from Build Vid.
Alright, well the pin just popped out. And the pin got sucked into my tape measure. And that's my mother-in-law calling. So now my tape measure's jammed with a T-pin. And as I pull it out, it's probably going to break it because I drilled a hole in it. Oh, come on. Oh my God. Only mothers-in-law can do this to you. Oh, there it is. And there's my pin. It's still in the 10. God. Alright, I'm going to do this one more time. And I'm going to keep the video going because everyone should know the challenges we face in our shops building airplanes. So, pin this here. I mean, really what I could do is, I know that one side is a scotch over 54, the other side's a scotch under 54, so if I can just get one side to come out 54 while the back is centered, right? Then we're off to the races. So right there, that one is just about 54. And this one should also be, right? Scotch over. Thing is, this, even with that little bit of tape, it moves too easily. I think this part of the video I'm going to be fast forwarding. Okay. 54, scotch over. Alright, so right there is perfect. Now, I'm going to double check it. I've been measuring to this front corner. I'm going to double check it by measuring the back corners now. And if I can do this without moving it, it's just over 57 3/8. Just over. Oh, it's just, yeah. It's so close. See, the thing is, you don't know how accurate your pin tape measure system is, so it's kind of impossible to know if there's any other. Oh, I just bumped it. It's hard to know exactly what you're dealing with, so you just try to do the best you can. Just over 57, just over 54, just over 54, just over 57. So the video ran out, the camera I'm using stops at 13 minutes. So the video stopped. But as the video stopped, I was just finishing up measuring this, and I was very happy with the results. So what I did was, I then, without having this move, or without allowing this to move, I traced the edge of the fuselage on the top and bottom, and then after I did that, just to make sure it didn't move while I was tracing it, I measured again, okay? And I was just talking about how if you're going to try to fly competitively, whether it's a scale competition, jets, IMAC, whatever, you need to be able to build to a very precise standard, a very exacting standard, because what's the use of having skills if you're constantly fighting the airplane because it was put together crooked? So having basic skills like this, being able to put things together and be very precise about it, especially being able to solve problems when you're working by yourself late at night in the shop, you don't have an extra set of hands, something like putting a pin through a tape measure so you can measure precisely by yourself, you know, that it helps to be able to solve problems like that. And I should say, if you are in the shop and you've got a problem and you can't come up with a solution, the next best thing to having help is having the internet. Come out to Giant Scale News, post a new thread. Doesn't matter how new you are to all of this stuff, post the thread, ask the question, and let people that have done this stuff try to help you out. Okay, so you can maybe see this. Let's hold it up for the camera. You can maybe see the lines. They're not very dark, but yeah, you can see them. There and there. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut those lines with a very sharp X-Acto knife. This is another basic skill. When you're cutting material, covering material off of a built structure, you want to just ever so slightly press on that material with a really sharp knife. It'll cut the material without cutting the underlying wood. You don't want slices in the wood structure where you remove the material, because that will weaken it, and just when you least expect it, that, it's called a stress riser, if you want to get technical, that little cut in the balsa, you'll have an excess of stress there and it'll snap. The bottom of this has already been cut, and I peeled the material back, and I just figured I would do this on video just to add to the overall completion of the project. So I've got my very faint pencil line on here, and I'm just going to cut. I mean, it's hardly any pressure at all if you've got a very sharp blade. And I'm going to make a couple of passes just because you could feel where there's a single color that it's already cut through, as opposed to this area that's black where there's multiple layers of covering material. Okay, and then I'll do the other side. Okay, same thing. I'm going to start down here. Keep the knife nice and straight. Okay. So, if I did my job, I should be able to peel this. I didn't quite get the front, or the leading edge, so there it is. Alright, and I'll do the same thing on this side. And like here, the covering's coming up a little bit. That's not a problem. We'll just stick it back down again before we glue it into place. Alright, so you can see it's I've only partially cut through, and that's because I wasn't pressing as hard up in the front. So I'm just going to very lightly try to score it so I can lift just the covering material. There it is. And hey, if just the black stuff comes off, you know, you take little victories and take what you can get at first. Okay, so that's pretty good right there. Okay, so that side looks good. This side is being a little more stubborn. There it goes. And I'm just going to cut. I'm going to come in about 1/8 of an inch because there's no glue. This isn't a gluing surface, is it? No. This isn't a gluing surface across the back here, so I'm just going to leave a little bit of material. And I don't have to worry about this as much as some of you guys. If you're going to use a gas engine, you want to leave covering material where you can so you can close things up and keep the exhaust out and the oils and stuff. This is electric, so if I have a little bit of exposed wood, you know, it's not like it's going to accumulate used up electrons. Alright, so there's the covering material. It's been cleared off, and I'll just clean up these little areas where this has to be glued into place. Alright, so that's that. It's ready to be glued in. Okay, so we have our horizontal stabilizer and the covering material has been stripped off of both sides. I just used my monocoat iron to reattach it to make sure it's nice and tight along the cut edges, because once it's in place and the epoxy's been in there, if there's a little bubble up near the edge, I might not be able to get it to lay down again. So you're better off doing it before you glue everything together. Same thing on the fuselage here. Another thing I should point out is there was some residue from covering material in where the wood is supposed to be bare. So I used some coarse sandpaper very lightly. I didn't really want to sand the wood, but I just wanted to remove the white residue from the covering material. And so that's kind of important. If you have a spot like this where there's a lot of covering adhesive left behind and it's in the wood, it's going to keep the epoxy from getting in and being able to make a strong bond. So I just used, where is it? Something like this, pretty coarse grit, and just lightly to get rid of any residue from the covering material. So this is going to go in like this, and this is going to be a long video, so I apologize. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to tape along the edge with blue tape. And this is just going to keep things from getting too messy. I'm not even really going to stick it up super hard. Okay, and I'm just a little bit, leaving a little bit of the covering material showing. This is just planning ahead, because you know when you start working with the epoxy and you mash this thing in there, there's going to be epoxy running out in large amounts. So I'm just doing this, and this will hopefully cut down on the amount of messy cleanup I'll have to do, okay? So, and I'm mumbling a little bit because I'm trying to build while I'm doing a video. It'd be easier to just build. I'd have the radio cranked up, you know, beer on the table. So in order to keep up with the mess, when this goes in like this, I can just wipe it with my finger. I don't have to worry about epoxy smearing all over the place. And then the other thing is, in case epoxy does get all over the place, I've got this rag, which is just an old t-shirt, and I've already soaked it with denatured alcohol. So the denatured alcohol is like a solvent that works on the epoxy. So if I do get a big glob somewhere here, or where, you know, basically where I don't want epoxy, I can just use this, and that'll clean it up. So I'm all set to go. I'm going to use 5-minute epoxy. I think I could do this successfully with 5-minute epoxy. If you have any doubts, then get yourself some 15 or 30-minute. So let's go. Let's get started. Well, and always make sure you make a big enough batch so that you don't run out. You don't want to be stingy whipping up your batch of epoxy and then run out and the stuff that you already put on starts to dry while you're trying to mix new stuff, and you're not really supposed to let new stuff bond. You don't want epoxy that's partially cured coming into contact with, you know, fresh stuff that hasn't started to cure yet. But epoxy will bond to dried epoxy almost as strong. Depending on the epoxy and how you prep it, you can get a bond, epoxy to epoxy bond, that's almost as strong as the underlying epoxy. So that's not a problem, but you shouldn't have two batches that are at different stages of curing, you know, coming into contact with each other. So you should always wet both sides also of a joint for best adhesion. So I'm just going to paint this on, and I made enough so that I can be a little sloppy with it. And that tape, like right now, the tape's paying off because I can be as messy as I want, and I know I'm going to have a good joint. And the cleanup is still going to be kind of reasonable. And this elevator's only got contact surface along the edges. There's nothing in the front. Just along the edges. That's all we're really worried about. Okay, so that's all wet. Put that over there, and then we'll goop this on. And if there's any voids, in the plywood, you want to make sure you get enough epoxy in there to fill them. Okay. And I'm just kind of using the side of the fuselage to knock the glue off the brush, so I make sure I get good contact. Alright, and my son is home. He's upstairs in the kitchen. My daughter's in the kitchen, so we're probably going to hear some yelling. They're 11 and 13, some of you guys will understand that. But I'm mumbling, so you might not hear me at all. Okay, a little more here and there. Alright, and I do have some epoxy already on the side of the fuselage, so my rag is going to clean that right up. Turn it inside out, do the other side. And I can see a little bit of epoxy kind of beading on the surface, which is good. Now normally I would do all this hard work and then put this in upside down, which I almost did. I almost went for it like that. So once this goes in, we're going to clean up, and then we're going to measure. So we're just going to clean up. I didn't even think about it, but I'm going to be able to bring this to Neat Fair because it's got an electric motor. Or it's going to have an electric motor. And you know, as I'm doing this, I'm just thinking, normally with an airplane, when you're putting it together, another measurement that you would have to do would be to make sure that the horizontal stabilizer is square with the fuselage like this. This is tapered, so let's see. It's tapered, so it's hard. It's the same on both sides though, but there is a little bit of play in that direction. So we'll double check that while this is setting up. Okay, so that's that. Let me just make sure there's no other messy epoxy leaking out. And I'm sorry I'm mumbling. I'm sorry if you can't hear me. Pretty clean on the bottom, pretty clean on the bottom. So I've already got my tape measure in place. So let's just measure it real quick. We want it to be just over 54 1/4 in the front, while being centered, and it has to be centered perfectly in the back. And then just over 57 3/8 in the back corner. So just over 54 1/4, just over 57 1/8. It's right about there. Right about there. Alright, that's it. Nothing else I could do. I'm going to leave this attached just in case I bump it. That should be perfect. Let me just make sure I'm square. You know, this is the horizontal stabilizer's tapered, so you can't just put a square on it because it'll show that it's out of square on both sides. About, you know, you'd say by the same amount. So the fit of the horizontal stabilizer is pretty tight, and knowing how these things are made in jigs and everything is laser cut, I'm just going to let it ride and assume that the accuracy of the, you know, the way it's built is going to keep everything aligned. But yeah, normally when you're building your airplane, you would want the horizontal stabilizer to be perfectly perpendicular with the vertical stabilizer. And I'm just gonna, knowing that we thought about it, knowing how the airplane's built, I could check it this way. Also, lining this up. And yeah, it's pretty dead on. Pretty dead on. I could get a bigger triangle also if I wanted to. Let's see. While this is setting up, I'm just going to do this. Alright, but we're almost done. Once the glue cures, we'll just take the tape off. Yeah, you can see the alignment through the square. So, okay, so once again the video stopped running while I was talking, which is fine. I've been talking too much already, but just one thing that I was trying to point out: epoxy in the cup, or epoxy in general, when it's curing, right? 5-minute epoxy, 15-minute, 30, whatever it is. As it's curing, it's generating heat. When you have a cup of epoxy where there's a little mass of it, the heat that it's generating while it's curing helps it to cure more quickly. So the epoxy in the cup will cure faster than the epoxy in the joint. The epoxy in the joint is dissipating heat into the balsa, into the wood around it. So don't assume just because the epoxy in the cup is cured that it's safe to start touching this and pulling on it and moving it around. Give it 2 or 3 times the time that it took for the epoxy to cure in the cup, for the epoxy in the joint to cure. Okay, so I'm not going to touch this. I'm going to let it sit for at least 25 or 30 minutes before I try to pull the tape off. But at that point, that's really the only assembly step on this airframe, which is another reason why we're using it for our group build. It's should be pretty straightforward for somebody coming in from, say, Foamies, to put this together to make it a flying airplane and be successful with it. So, alright, thank you for watching. Sorry our video that was supposed to cover a lot of stuff only covered this one step, but I think we covered it pretty thoroughly. So if you're doing this for the first time, you should be able to tackle it yourself.